if you take a coin purse
Right.
and you fill it with money, and
Yeah.
then you permanently sew the bottom shut, you'd probably think you're, I don't know, securing your future.
Yeah. Building a nest egg.
Exactly. But according to the radical socioeconomic premise we are examining in this deep dive, you aren't saving wealth at all. You are actively suffocating your society.
Which is a heavy claim.
It is, because the argument on the table is that the overarching system governing a society's resources, it isn't based on arbitrary luck. It's not just random market forces. It's built on this unbreakable law of circulation. Basically, whatever you spend into a healthy system, the system automatically replaces. It acts as the ultimate provider.
Right. Which, I mean, that immediately requires us to completely reevaluate what we mean by the word spending.
Definitely.
Because we are pulling this concept from a really highly analytical lecture by a 20th century thinker named Allama Parvez. And he's analyzing a very specific text, right?
Yeah.
Verses 39 through 49 of Surah Saba, which is a chapter in the Quran.
And usually people read texts like this through a heavily theological lens.
Mystical.
Right. Oh, absolutely. They look for spiritual comfort, religious dogma. But Parvez does something entirely different here. He strips all that mysticism away completely. He reads this specific passage as a literal mechanical blueprint for macroeconomics and for societal collapse.
Okay, so for you listening right now, even if you have zero background in theology, which is fine because we are totally ignoring the theology today anyway, we need to define the foundational mechanism Parvez extracts here.
The word infaq.
Yes, infaq. If you look up standard translations, it usually just says charity or spending, which, I mean, that kind of gives the impression of a billionaire writing a philanthropic check at some gala, right? Just to feel good about themselves.
Yeah, tax write-off.
Exactly. But Parvez argues that reading it as optional charity completely guts the actual structural reality of the word. It trivializes it, really, because to understand what he's getting at, you have to look at the etymology of infaq. The root letters in Arabic N, F, Q, they literally refer to a tunnel.
A tunnel.
Yeah, specifically a tunnel that is open at both ends, like a burrow that a field mouse or a badger might dig. You enter one side, you exit the other.
Okay.
So by applying this to economics, Parvez is saying that infaq isn't some polite suggestion to be a generous person. It is the foundational structural law of a surviving society. Wealth has to be kept open. It acts as a conduit, it flows in, and it must immediately flow out for the collective benefit of humanity.
Okay, I conceptually get the tunnel analogy. Wealth flows in, wealth flows out. But let me push back here immediately.
Go for it.
Because translating a badger's tunnel to human economics feels, well, incredibly utopian, if not totally financially suicidal.
How so?
I mean, in the real world, if I run a business, right,
Yeah.
and I have a massive surplus in Q4, my instinct is absolutely not to just let it flow out the other end of the tunnel.
Right, you want to keep it.
My instinct is to build a vault. I want to save it for a downturn. I want to secure my company's runway.
So are you saying Parvez views that basic human instinct to save as a societally destructive force?
Okay, that is the exact friction point we really need to wrestle with today, because there is a massive functional difference between personal financial buffering and systemic structural hoarding.
Okay.
Parvez is not targeting, your personal emergency fund or a company keeping a 6-month runway. He is diagnosing the macro-level accumulation of capital.
Like billionaires.
Exactly. When vast sums of wealth are permanently removed from circulation just to generate more capital for the individual holding it, and it produces zero tangible collective value. To make this concrete, he actually contrasts the tunnel analogy with this metaphor of an autumn tree.
Oh, I have that metaphor in my notes. It's such a striking visual, because normally when we think of a tree shedding its leaves in autumn, we associate it with death, right, or at least dormancy.
Right, winter is coming. Yeah. But Parvez points out this biological imperative. A tree must shed its dead yellow leaves. It throws them off, it spends them into the soil, basically decomposing them to feed the root system.
Yes, to prepare for the spring.
Exactly, so that fresh green shoots can emerge. Now, if that tree somehow developed this misplaced instinct for self-preservation and decided to hoard its dry leaves,
It used to drop them.
yeah, it would literally suffocate its own canopy, and it would starve its roots. Hoarding the dead leaves stops new growth. Shedding them is the exact mechanism that brings life.
So let's map that biological mechanism directly onto an economy. What is the actual functional difference between a society that circulates its resources like that tree and one that hoards them in sealed vaults?
Right.
When capital is locked away, say, massive corporate stock buybacks, or, I don't know, Wall Street firms buying up single-family housing just to artificially inflate rent prices?
Ugh.
Yeah.
Rather than building new housing.
Exactly. That is the economic equivalent of the tree hoarding dead leaves. The wealth expands mathematically for the holder, sure, but it produces absolutely nothing for the system. The text actually labels this predatory, stagnant accumulation as riba.
Wait, let me stop you right there. Because if a listener has heard the word riba before, they almost certainly associate it strictly with Islamic finance.
Right. Usually it's translated as interest or usury on a loan.
Yeah, like a bank charging 7% on a mortgage, or those predatory payday lenders charging like 400% interest.
And that is the traditional, strictly legalistic translation. But again, Parwez rips that definition right out of the theological vacuum. He looks at its absolute mathematical function.
Okay, so how does he define it?
Well, if infaq is the tunnel, the flowing river, then riba is the dam that creates the stagnant pond. Riba isn't just about a bank loan. Structurally, it's any mechanism where wealth swells or inflates purely for the individual holding it while extracting from the collective.
Extracting, not contributing.
Exactly. In fact, the literal linguistic root of the word riba means to swell or to expand unnaturally, like a tumor.
Oh, wow.
Right, think about it. A tumor grows rapidly, taking up resources, but it doesn't contribute to the biological function of the body. It just extracts until the host dies.
So if riba is the tumor, what is the mechanism of the cure? Because Parwez claims that when wealth flows back into the collective, when the tunnel is open through infaq, the system itself becomes what the text calls the best of providers, or Kara al-Rezakan.
Right?
But I'm sorry, that sounds like a magical promise to me. Spend your money and the universe will provide. How does that actually work mechanically? Because we said no mystical thinking today.
There's absolutely no magic required here. It is pure macroeconomics. Think about the velocity of money.
Okay.
If a billionaire hoards $100 million in an offshore account, that money has a velocity of 0. It does nothing. But if that same $100 million is pushed through the tunnel, invested into infrastructure, used to build a factory, or just paid out as higher wages to thousands of workers, what happens?
Well, those workers take that money and they immediately spend it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They buy groceries, they fix their cars, they buy clothes for their kids. That spending becomes income for the grocer, the mechanic, the tailor.
And then the grocer uses that income to buy more inventory from a farmer.
Right. It's the economic multiplier effect.
Yeah.
A single dollar, if it keeps moving, can facilitate $10 worth of actual economic activity.
So the system itself regenerates the provision?
Precisely. The grocer, the mechanic, and the farmer are all sustained, not by some magical deity dropping gold from the sky, but by the structural reality of the open tunnel. When the text says the system is the best of providers, it's describing a mathematically verifiable reality. Economies thrive on circulation, not accumulation.
So hoarding is an active suppression of societal growth. It actively starves the roots of the tree. Okay, so I want you, the person listening right now, to apply this lens to your own society's economic engine. Just look at the structures around you. Is your society operating as an open tunnel where wealth is constantly cycling back through, creating new growth, funding research, building things?
Or is it a sealed vault?
Right. A sealed vault where resources are systematically siphoned upward, locked away in speculative assets, and shielded from circulation. Because if the structural analysis is correct, a sealed vault doesn't just impoverish the people at the bottom. It guarantees the eventual rotting of the entire tree.
Which forces us to ask a deeply, deeply uncomfortable psychological question.
It does.
If a hoarded, stagnant system is so clearly destructive to the vast majority of the people living inside it, why does it persist? Why don't the lower and middle classes just immediately dismantle the sealed vaults? Unjust, inequitable societies manage to survive for centuries.
Yeah, that is the paradox, isn't it?
It is, and the text Parwez analyzes provides a specific structural answer to this. The persistence of the system relies entirely on the worship of false patrons.
The concept of clientage. This is where Parwez's historical context gets eerily familiar. Because the wealthy elite, the ones defending the sealed vaults and opposing any kind of open tunnel systems, they've historically relied on a very specific strategy.
And it's not just physical force.
No, they use the psychological intimidation of their hoarding power. According to the text, their historical boast was essentially, we have abundant wealth and we have the numbers. So they used their hoarded wealth to build these massive, intricate systems of dependency.
Right.
They intentionally structured society so that the vulnerable were forced to lean on them just for basic survival.
We really have to unpack the socioeconomic Stockholm syndrome happening here, because it is one of the most recurring failure modes of human civilization. A predatory class hoards the resources, which artificially creates scarcity.
Right, they starve the market.
Yeah. Then they trickle just enough of those resources back down to the vulnerable to position themselves as saviors or patrons. And the vulnerable, who are terrified of losing what little they have, end up fiercely defending the very people who are extracting from them.
I was actually trying to find a modern equivalent for this dynamic because talking about, ancient patrons and clients can feel a little dusty.
Here.
And it struck me that this is the exact psychological architecture of a massive corporate Ponzi scheme or a deeply corrupt corporate monopoly. Think about the middle managers and the lower level employees in one of those structures.
Oh, man. They blindly trust the untouchable executives at the top.
Absolutely blindly. They enforce the draconian corporate policies. They aggressively defend the company against whistleblowers. And they genuinely believe the CEO is this visionary genius who is going to protect their pensions and their livelihoods. They pledge total loyalty.
And Parwez's analysis cuts right through the illusion of that loyalty. He points out that these false authorities, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about literal stone idols in antiquity or feudal lords or those untouchable corporate executives today, they are entirely hollow.
Hollow.
Yes, they project immense godlike power, but it's an absolute mirage. The critical insight he draws from the text is this inevitable moment of accountability.
Right.
Because when the system inevitably collapses under the mathematical weight of its own inequity, when the Ponzi scheme runs out of new investors or the hoarded economy simply breaks, what do the patrons do?
The executives pull the ripcord. The second the SEC kicks down the door or the audit reveals the missing funds, the CEO does not stand shoulder to shoulder with the middle managers.
No, they do not.
They deploy their golden parachutes, they fly off to some non-extradition country, or they file for a strategic bankruptcy that completely protects their personal assets, and they leave all those fiercely loyal defensive followers completely holding the bag. The protection they offered was never real.
And the text describes this so vividly. It says that on the day of accountability, the false patrons instantly disown their followers. They literally claim, we never asked to be worshipped.
Wow.
The patron never actually cared about the client. The executive never cared about the middle manager. They only cared about using them as a human shield to protect the hoarded wealth.
So this really demands a severe moment of self-reflection for anyone navigating modern power dynamics. Where are you pledging loyalty to false authorities in your own professional or civic life?
Right.
How often do we defend a broken corporate policy or a corrupt political establishment just because that's the way it's always been done? Under this naive assumption that the system will somehow reward our loyalty, the mathematical reality is that a system built on hoarding has zero loyalty to its foundation. It will liquidate you the second it needs to balance the books.
Absolutely. So if these patrons are completely hollow, if their power is just a projection, what is the mechanism that finally shatters the illusion?
This brings us to what I consider the most powerful philosophical declaration in the entire lecture. Parwez highlights a specific phrase from the text. Truth has come, and falsehood can neither originate anything nor restore it.
To understand the weight of that statement, we have to kind of throw out our colloquial understanding of the words truth and falsehood. Parwez is analyzing the Arabic word al-haq, which translates to truth. But in this specific Quranic and socioeconomic context, truth is not some abstract philosophical concept.
It's not just a subjective personal belief.
No. Al-haq means a constructive, mathematically sound system that proves its validity through tangible, life-giving results in the real world. Truth builds infrastructure. Truth feeds people. Truth works.
And falsehood.
Falsehood, on the other hand, is defined by its absolute fundamental sterility.
Sterility. The source material uses this brilliant visual analogy to explain the physics of that sterility. It argues that falsehood doesn't actually possess independent existence. It's not a substance you can hold in your hand. Falsehood is merely the absence of truth, in the exact same way that darkness is purely the absence of light.
I love this analogy.
Right. You can't measure the mass of darkness. You can't scoop darkness into a bucket and carry it out of a room.
Oh.
If you're standing in a subterranean cave, pitch black, the darkness feels incredibly oppressive. It feels heavy, intimidating, permanent.
Yeah.
But the moment you strike a single matchstick, just this tiny, fragile chemical reaction creating a flicker of light, the darkness instantly flees. It has to. It possesses zero structural integrity to fight back against the light.
So let's pull that visual out of the cave and apply it to the socioeconomic productivity gap Parwes is highlighting. When the text declares that falsehood can neither originate anything nor restore it, it is diagnosing the fatal flaw of parasitic extractive systems.
Right.
A corrupt regime, a hoarded economy, a corporate monopoly built on exploiting labor. These systems can distort reality. They can manipulate markets. They can ruthlessly extract wealth that other people have created. But they fundamentally lack the capacity to build. They cannot originate a genuinely new, life-giving paradigm.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go ahead.
Because if I look at history, some of the most oppressive, extractive empires in the world built incredible things. I mean, the Roman Empire relied heavily on slavery and extraction, but they built aqueducts that are literally still standing today.
Okay, fair.
And massive modern tech monopolies, which many would argue operate on extractive hoarding principles, they build these insane logistics networks that can deliver a package to my door in 4 hours. So how can Parwes claim that these systems originate nothing? They clearly build things.
That is a crucial distinction we need to make. We have to separate the concept of extraction from origination.
Okay, explain that.
Did the Roman senators build the aqueducts? Or did they extract the labor of engineers and enslave people to assemble them? Did the modern tech monopoly originate the physical reality of logistics? Or did they simply hoard enough capital to buy up and optimize the labor of thousands of warehouse workers and drivers?
Ah.
Parwes is arguing that the system of falsehood itself, the hoarding mechanism, is sterile. It only survives by attaching itself like a leech to the productive capacity of the people it exploits.
Oh, I see. It's like a virus.
Exactly.
A virus is technically not even a living organism. It can't reproduce on its own. It has to hijack a healthy host cell, use the host's machinery to replicate, and eventually it destroys the host. The virus originates nothing. It only hijacks.
Exactly. And that leads to the inevitable historical aha moment. This is the mechanical reason why every single oppressive hoarding society eventually crumbles, while equitable ones have the capacity to advance.
Because the virus eventually kills the host.
Yes. An unjust system can coast on stolen momentum for a remarkably long time, sometimes centuries, by continuously expanding and finding new populations or resources to extract from. But eventually, the empire runs out of new territories to conquer. The monopoly runs out of middle-class wealth to siphon. And because falsehood cannot originate anything on its own, the society stagnates, it collapses, and it cannot restore itself. It cannot bring a dead system back to life.
Only a truthful, equitable system, one based on the open tunnel circulation of info, has the creative capacity to renew itself from the roots up.
Correct.
Okay, so let's put ourselves in the shoes of someone living deep inside one of these stagnant viral systems.
All right.
You are sitting in the pitch-black room. The corporate or political patrons are hoarding all the wealth. The economic engine is sterile and failing. But everyone around you is still fiercely, blindly loyal to the executives with the golden parachutes. How does an individual trapped in that darkness actually find the matchstick? What is the mechanism of escape? Parwes points to a specific demand made in the text, and it completely contradicts the way most traditional institutions operate. The mechanism is not blind faith. It is radical independent reason.
The rational summons. If there's a turning point in this entire socioeconomic theory, this is it. We have to look at the scenario playing out in the verses. The messenger in the text is standing before a massive hostile crowd.
People deeply entrenched in the system.
Yes, defending their false patrons. And how does he try to break their conditioning? He does not demand that they adopt a new religious dogma. He doesn't ask for blind submission. He doesn't threaten them with mystical curses. He says, essentially, I only want one single thing from you. Think.
The Arabic word used is tafakkur. Use your raw intellect. Reflect. Ponder the mathematical reality of what your society is doing.
Yes. But the brilliance of this summons is in the specific physical instruction attached to it. He doesn't just tell the crowd to think. He tells them to stand up in twos and singly.
Singly, like alone.
Right. Stand up in pairs. Or stand up completely alone and then think. We have to probe the psychology of this demand. Why specifically separate people from the mob? Why not just appeal to the crowd as a whole?
Well, because appealing to a crowd's intellect is biologically impossible. If you look at modern neurology and crowd psychology going all the way back to thinkers like Gustave Le Bon, when a human being is subsumed within a massive, highly emotional mob, the prefrontal cortex essentially powers down.
Wow.
It does. The prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain responsible for logic, long-term planning, and independent reasoning. When you are in a crowd chanting a slogan, you are not thinking. You are just reacting to the emotional contagion of the people sweating and yelling next to you.
You are operating purely on inherited momentum. The text actually refers to this phenomenon as following the Aslav, or the ancestors. The mob's logic is entirely circular. This is what our forefathers believed. This is how we have always structured our economy. Therefore, it is right, and anyone who questions it is a threat.
Right.
Parwes offers a severe critique of corrupt systems here. He points out that extractive hoarding systems actually ban critical thinking as a matter of pure survival. If a citizen starts doing the math, if they start pointing out that the tree is dying because the elites are hoarding the leaves, the system does not engage them in a rational debate.
They can't debate because falsehood has no structural integrity to stand on. So instead, they attack the messenger. The text notes that the corrupt society immediately labels the reformer as mad.
Yes.
They call him insane, dangerous, radical. They use the overwhelming volume of the mob to enforce intellectual conformity.
But the text argues that this illusion of madness is purely a product of the mob's noise. The antidote is isolation. When you step away from the crowd, when you physically and psychologically remove yourself from the echo chamber and sit down alone, singly, or with just one other rational person in twos, the emotional contagion breaks.
You sober up.
Exactly. You apply sober mathematical reflection to the state of your society. You look at the hoarded wealth, the sterile economy, the false patrons, and in that quiet moment of tafakkur, the illusion shatters. You realize the reformer isn't mad at all.
The reformer is simply a warner. They are the person looking at the structural foundation of the building and pointing out that the mathematically certain collapse of the unjust society is imminent. It's like the person in 2007 looking at the housing market data while everyone else is getting rich flipping mortgages.
That's a perfect analogy.
The mob calls them crazy for not joining the party. But when you sit down alone and actually run the numbers, you realize the crash is inevitable.
I really think this is the most actionable takeaway for anyone listening right now. We need to evaluate our own modern echo chambers, because we live in an era defined by algorithmic mobs.
Oh, absolutely.
How often do we accept an economic philosophy, or defend a political stance, or participate in a flawed system simply because the timeline we scroll through is cheering for it? We get completely swept up in the outrage of the day, relying on the sheer volume of the crowd as proof of truth.
Right.
The radical demand being made by this ancient text is to hit pause, turn off the noise, isolate yourself from the crowd's emotional contagion, and use your own raw, independent intellect. Is the system you are defending actually generating life, or are you just terrified of standing alone?
And let's be honest, standing alone requires immense psychological courage. Stepping away from the crowd means abandoning the comfort of the false patrons. It means facing the pitch-black room and taking on the responsibility of striking the matchstick yourself.
But as Parwes synthesizes this entire lecture, he reveals why that individual courage is so structurally vital. Because if we pull all these threads together, we see a masterfully cohesive, unified theory here.
Yeah, let's tie it all up.
We started with the structural argument of infaq. A just economy operates like an open tunnel, regenerating what is spent, while riba, or hoarding, starves the roots. We saw how false patrons use hoarded wealth to create a mirage of protection, only to abandon their clients when the system inevitably crashes. We defined falsehood as fundamentally sterile, capable of extracting but incapable of originating life. And we just identified the ultimate remedy, clear-eyed, rational reflection achieved by stepping away from the mob.
So how does Parwes tie the economic mechanics to the psychological remedy? Because on the surface, talking about wealth distribution and talking about critical thinking, they seem like two entirely different academic disciplines, right? Economics over here, epistemology over there.
Right, but Parwes' final highest level insight is that they are not separate disciplines at all. They are intrinsically, fundamentally fused.
Yep.
He demonstrates that how a society handles its capital and how society handles its knowledge are governed by the exact same mechanism.
Right.
The exact same systemic order that demands the open tunnel circulation of wealth also demands and relies upon the free circulation of honest, independent thinking.
I see. It's the open tunnel applied to the human mind.
Yes. And conversely, Hoarding wealth for personal stagnant gain and hoarding old dogmas through blind, unthinking imitation of the Aslaf, they are simply two faces of the exact same societal decay.
Wow.
If you observe a society that ruthlessly locks its wealth in sealed vaults, protecting the elite at the expense of the collective, you will inevitably find that same society locking its intellect in the past. They will ban new ideas, they will rely on blind tradition, and they will label reformers as mad. Both are acts of sterile hoarding. Both actively prevent regeneration.
That is incredibly profound. A sealed vault of money and a closed mind are the exact same pathology. And there is one final piece of evidence from the text that Parwez points to, which acts as the ultimate proof of concept for this entire system.
Right, the messenger's final statement.
Exactly. The messenger, after making this massive, highly disruptive demand for people to abandon their patrons, open their vaults, and start thinking for themselves, says one final thing to the crowd. He says, "I ask you for no reward."
Which is huge.
He demands no money. He asks for no political office. He is not trying to build a new system of clientage with himself at the top.
Which is the ultimate litmus test for any genuine reformer versus a new false patron. If he had asked for a cut of their wealth in exchange for his guidance, he would just be setting up a new Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
It would be a grift.
Right.
By explicitly asking for absolutely nothing, it mathematically proves that the mission is entirely about societal elevation, not personal extraction. He is striking the match simply because the room is dark and the society is dying, not because he holds the patent on light and wants to charge you a subscription fee to see it.
It strips away any excuse the mob might have to dismiss him as a grifter, forcing them to evaluate the message purely on its own stark rational merit. And that leaves us with a profound framework to evaluate our own reality today. If hoarding capital starves the society's physical body, and hoarding old dogma starves the society's collective mind, well, what happens when a society fundamentally shifts its metrics? What happens when we measure our success not by what we manage to lock away in bank vaults and unquestioned traditions, but by the speed and scale at which our wealth and our ideas freely circulate?
It creates a society capable of originating life, rather than just extracting it until the collapse.
So as you go back to your day, take a hard look around your world. Look at the institutions, the algorithms, and the politicians telling you to keep the vault closed and the mind shut. Step away from the crowd. Sit down alone in quiet reflection and think about it. Are you fiercely holding on to a dead leaf, or are you ready to finally let it drop so the spring can arrive?